Hi, this is Scott Bradfield, and this is episode something or other of Reading Great Books in the Bathtub. We are up to chapter 15 of Ulysses, which we're trying to kind of race through in these last few weeks because I'm kind of fed up with it. And it's 18 hours. They cover it because of 18 chapters altogether. So I keep forgetting. And we are in the far and away the longest chapter and most exasperating chapter in the book, far and away. As I mentioned in the previous chapters, we're getting into these kind of prima donna-ish chapters. So in the early chapters, in the first half of the book, Joyce is at least thinking about his character and where he's taking his character through the day, and he's sculpting those chapters not simply to present different modernist versions of reality. He's actually sculpting them a bit narratively, so we don't have every single thing that happens for an entire hour. For example, take the second chapter with Mr. DC when Stephen goes to teach. We're not getting everything belabored so we can fill it up with this huge long chapter. And these later chapters get longer and longer. This one's about 150 pages, and it probably should be 40. Okay, that's my personal take on it. Now, one big thing is starting to happen. We did a lot of prep work on Ulysses, talking about some of just the basic narrative techniques in all storytelling. I did the thing with the giddy app on the board. So we have visual representations, things that the character sees. We have thoughts in the point of view of the character who sees those things. Time is moving along at a fairly brisk pace. We're not seeing every single thing that happens to the character, but we're seeing significant moments as they develop. All of those were sort of fairly narrative, basic techniques that Joyce does very well through most of the book. And in these last few chapters, he pretty much goes off the map as far as he can. The chapter 15 that we're in is known as the Ulysses in Nighttown chapter. So we're abandoning almost all of those techniques for a sort of theatrical version of reality. And it's a theatrical version of reality which is completely unreal because it's a fantastic, nightmarish, druggish, everyone's drunk and we're getting all these kind of ridiculous visions of the world. They're not filtered through any one character. They are narrative. Not narrative. They're dramatic. So we're watching this hallucination happen. We're not seeing that hallucination through Bloom or through Stephen, but a kind of composite of the city and the town and the kind of delirium of this place as Joyce represents it. So we've kind of abandoned some of those old techniques and for a theatrical version of unreality, we should say. I want to go through it fairly quickly because I find most of the important parts are few and far between in this chapter, and there's lots of long hallucinations that belabor fairly basic points. So we start off, and basically we're going to a place called they call it Nighttown, and it's in Mabbott Street, and they're all the drunken boys who've left the maternity hospital are going off to get drunk and get laid. So they're all looking for a whorehouse, and they're all running through this town. This is a really poor part of town, and it's all the people who live in that poor town. So it's almost they're grotesques. They're like a Fellini-esque group of grotesques who are again exaggerated by this hallucinatory presentation. So as we go into it, at first we see idiots and children and pygmy women and gnomes and scrofulous children. And Sissy Caffrey is there, who was in an earlier was a character who showed up earlier. And we have a couple of military guys, Private Carr and Private Compton, who will show up at the end of the story. The chapter's fairly well framed, so we come in with these two privates going out there trying to get laid and get drunk. And then we're going to close off our chapter where they're going to come back into this long chapter. So they're wandering around trying to get laid, and everyone's singing dirty songs. So we have anything that sounds dirty, you can pretty much figure is dirty. One of the songs that one of the girls is singing, Sissy is singing, I gave it to Nellie to stick in her belly, the leg of the duck, the leg of the duck. And you can pretty much imagine what we're talking about here. Stephen shows up on it. A number of characters almost everyone from the book comes into this hallucination. What's happening? How much of it's real and how much is a hallucination isn't entirely clear, though the reality of certain scenes will become clear, particularly near the end of the chapter. So there's probably these two privates coming into these two military guys wandering into Nighttown, and then Stephen shows up, and we're getting lots of heightened fantasy. We get just really kind of grotesque pictures of one guy blowing a stream of snot. Bloom shows up at the bottom of 565, and we have them wandering through, and as Bloom shows up drunk, and all the characters are drunk, Bloom starts fantasizing. He sees a vision of his father, and then he sees a vision of Molly. His kind of enslavement to Molly is joked about throughout large passages here, how he just basically, she runs his life, and he can't stand up to her. He's not man enough. They'll mention this quite a bit, to stand up to her. Gertie McDowell, the limping girl from the beachfront scene, shows up, and she talks about when she sees Bloom, she says, I shared with you all my worldly goods, when she lifted her skirt at the beach. And it's not clear whether she's really there, to my mind, or whether she's just a fantasy, because Bloom goes into a long delusion. There's a very long delusory scene here in which Bloom meets a lot of the women he fancied or had some sort of relationship with, sometimes just a cuddle in the back of a party or in the back of a cab. So we meet Mrs. Breen, who was a friend of Molly's, and they have a fantasy exchange. And we have a bunch of whores start to show up onto the streets, and lots more military guys looking for women. Gary Owen, the horrible dog, shows up. And then the watch shows up. So two basically cops who patrol the neighborhood show up. The first watch and the second watch show up on 581. And when they come in and ask Bloom who he is and what his name is, we have kind of a release as Bloom is caught in this kind of place he shouldn't be, and fantasizing about all these women he shouldn't really be fantasizing about. He goes into a long guilt trip. And the guilt trip goes on for many, many pages here. Again, he begins to feel he's under trial. He starts to imagine that a fantasy trial starts to come out about everyone accusing him of all the women he tried to seduce. And we have a long passage in 592, for example, about the different women. And one of the things that comes up in this passage is the idea that Bloom likes to be spanked. And this has come up before. We've seen this notion that he's kind of a masochist. And we remember back to the very early chapters when he sees that woman who used to do the take care of the laundry out in the back, and he's thinking about how good she looked when she was whacking the rug. And that whacking of a rug image starts to come back throughout this. So the idea that he likes the danger, and that he likes to be punished for all his badness is part of the thrill he gets. He starts to have he goes from two fantasies. One which is, he deserves nothing. He's a horrible person. He's nasty. He does things for which he feels guilty. And the obverse of that is he feels these delusions of grandeur. So then he starts to imagine himself as the Lord Mayor of, again, it's not him imagining, but we get a dramatic vision of him as Lord Mayor, which is a sort of a dramatization of all these interior conflicts. We get lots of long passages, 602 to 603, in which these huge hallucinatory parades go through Nighttown. And one about the church, and there's one about kind of anarchy. And they go on for long periods of time. In this section here, Bloom starts to fantasize about being the Lord Mayor, and he's the next Parnell, and he's going to save Ireland. Again, very, very long chapter. He's going to bring together all the different religions. He thinks on 610 he wants to create a world for all Jews and Muslims and Gentiles, and save the social life of Dublin. He meets a lot of historical figures through here. And eventually, I'm going to skip as far as I can, because this long fantasy scene is, parts of it are really boring. And we eventually get to the whorehouse. around 622, where all the characters start to come together. For example, Stephen's there, and a number of the other friends that they were drinking with start to show up, and sorry, there we go, and we get the mentions of Circe. Again, we're trying to avoid Ulysses, but this is known as the Circe chapter, when Ulysses and all his shipmates are hypnotized or are drugged by this witch who wants to keep them there. Lots of dirty jokes. More dirty jokes. We have some references to the man in the Macintosh, the brown Macintosh, which is one of those puzzles that some people like to spend their time solving. On and on and on. This chapter is too long. But they get together and all the prostitutes come in, all the whores are there, and the fantasies of Bloom start to include his incarnation as Henry Flower. You remember Henry Flower is the man. He signs his name, Henry Flower, to that woman he's having the pen pal relationship with. Stephen shows up, and his a fantasy vision of his father. And there's lots of references in here about page 642 that Bloom, again, we have one passage where he's actually dressed up like a woman, that he's actually a woman and not a man. And that feeling that he's always been taking care of everything around the house, and that Molly runs things, is dramatized through here. There's one funny bit in 643 where Bloom, who loves women, remembers as a young man his fantasy job was to be a shoe fitter, or to help women put their shoes on in a shoe shop, which would have been a great job for him. It might have killed him. He's starting to visualize all these people as pigs. There's lots of fantasy visions of he's imagining Blazes Boylan having sex with his wife, and the prostitutes are describing this fantasy vision. On and on. Again, we'll get a lot of jokes about how he doesn't deserve. He's really kind of this horrible person, and there's one moment in page 656. He used to buy these photo magazines, and the model from the photo magazine shows up from something called Photo Bits, and talks about how he used to put her picture up basically so he could masturbate to this photo. There's a lot of kind of places in here you can see why this is where some of the case against the obscenity in this book was leveled against this section. Okay, now about page 665, the kind of fantastic vision is slowly kind of settling down. And we can actually sort of see Bloom meeting Stephen, and he offers to help Stephen with the money. And the partying goes on and on. A lot of the characters, minor characters, start coming in and going. Molly comes back and her father. There's a reference on 676 to all the mobs and the people and the hallucinations of all these people out in the street. And Stephen makes a reference to our friend, the noise in the street, and that notion for Stephen that God is this person screaming in the street, that it's this kind of chaos of human life. And we get a lot of chaos in these chapters. Stephen's mother shows up on 680. Again, our big picture of Stephen is that he feels guilty about his mother, and she comes up through the floor. He sees her coming up through the floor, this kind of decayed vision of his mother coming to check on him and ask him why he's in this whorehouse, basically, which makes Stephen drop everything and run out. He's drunk, and he runs out of the whorehouse, and Bloom follows him. And on 686, 687-ish, as he is out in the street, we have a couple of important things that kind of everything's reiterated. We don't get anything really new in this passage, but the problems that Stephen has with his father and wants to get away from his father and be free of his father is also a sense of being free of Ireland and being free of the church. So that's kind of brought back to the center of some of his thoughts on page 688. And then he runs into those two privates who were at the beginning, Private Carr and the other private. And he gets in an argument with them, particularly about a girl that's with them. Isn't that what it is? I just finished reading it. Oh, he started saying a lot of things about the king. Stephen's saying a lot of things that upset them about royalty and the king that supports them, or the king who they supposedly admire, and they punch him. One of them punches him. And then the watch shows up again. So we have a kind of a structure to the story where the privates show up at the beginning, and then the watch shows up and puts Bloom on trial in his imagination. And then near the end of the chapter, this long chapter, things are settling down, and we're actually seeing the scenes in which Stephen gets in an altercation with these people, and the watch comes out to help him. Bloom finds him and wants to take care of him, and sees him as this man. He's, his son, is a young man who he admires for having intelligence, and he decides to take Stephen home. And again, Stephen doesn't have a home because he's given up the keys. Remember early in the book. And at the end, as he's walking him off, the most moving part of the chapter comes at the conclusion. As he's walking him home, he imagines a kind of royal personage going past, or middle class, a well-off person going past in a carriage. And he imagines it's Rudy, his son, who was basically stillborn, who didn't survive birth. And he sees Rudy as this kind of gentleman, someone who's been very successful and who's dressed very well. And it's quite a moving little passage when he just sees this young man go past, who could have been his son, who's become this really handsome, genteel person with a delicate mauve face and diamond and ruby buttons. And it closes on this vision of his real son or his dead son going past as he escorts Stephen into the closing chapters of the book. It's 150, 60 pages. It should be 40, particularly with that nice closing moment in the chapter. We have 3 more chapters to go, and we're going to try to get them done soon. Okay, take care. Bye.